and welcome back to the Empowering Peer Educators podcast. I'm Lakin, and we are here with Maddie again. How are you doing?
Doing all right today. How are
Excited.
you?
Good. Thank you for being here today. So, in this episode, we will be discussing relationships, boundaries, and bystander intervention. I want to remind everyone to have their formative assessment in front of them and be sure to fill it out in this episode's portion of prompts. Let's jump right in.
Excellent. Sounds great. I love it.
So, we are going to start with relationship red flags. So, in an abusive relationship, we know that it doesn't normally start with abuse. So, what signs would you suggest that we look out for?
Yeah. I would say anytime I'm talking about red flags, I think an important thing to remember is that just because there's the presence of like a singular red flag does not automatically mean it's an abusive relationship. What I think is important to understand, though, is that a red flag is still a red flag, so it's worth addressing in some way, shape, or form. So even if we're not sure we want to throw on a big, scary label of this experience, I think a red flag is still trying to communicate something to us. And one of those could be intensity. So intensity is this idea that the relationship is moving at a pace that is you're not comfortable with, or is just moving at a scary, quick pace. So the example I usually give is that it's day 3 after a Tinder date and they're sending you Zillow links of the house you guys are going to buy together, and here's what the nursery is going to look like, and we'll put in a fence so we can have 3 dogs. And you're just like, whoa, I just met you 3 days ago. Like, that's a little crazy. And so then I know that example, it's supposed to be like a little, like, is that actually real? Like, I know it's happened in the world. But I think the important thing about that example is, like, we probably all had like a gut reaction to that. We were like, whoa, that's scary. Listen to that feeling. If you're feeling that in the relationship at the pace that's happening, I'd say that's the feeling to cue in on.
Listen to your gut.
Exactly. Listen to your gut. And then another big one that we look out for is volatility. So that's the idea that there's frequent breakups and makeups, but it's really ugly breakups and it's really flowery, over the top makeups. So I've seen, like, I've had friends be in and out of relationships before, on again, off again, and I wouldn't have said that those were abusive necessarily. I would have said, like, can we just stop dating? Like, clearly we're not good. Like, we're not working out. But the key part of that example is the ugly breakups, and then the as if nothing ever happened when they get back together, kind of that pretending to brush it aside when things were ugly before. And so looking out for that. I think volatility is also important. Like, what it can start looking like is if you start to self-censor yourself because you're fearful of the other person's reaction. Of, like, you're no longer going to share your feelings. You're no longer going to share your thoughts. You're not going to share updates about your friends or this thing that happened at work because you're scared of what they might say or do. Or you just, you know what, it's just easier to keep the peace. I would say a big one is that if you start changing, like, your own, you don't necessarily agree with the thing they're saying. They're saying, like, don't go hang out with your friends. But all of a sudden, you just start complying with that because it's just easier. It's just easier to keep the peace, and you know there's not going to be an argument if you're just like, okay, fine, I won't go hang out with my friends. Like, those are things to start looking out for when we're talking about volatility. Also, belittling and criticizing. Those are big red flags. And these aren't the fun little jabs we tell our friends every now and then just to, like, be funny. But these are the things that, like, hit on our insecurities. They know they hit on our insecurities, and they're going to push those because they are slowly but surely chipping away at our self-worth, because the less worthy we feel, the less human we feel, the more likely we are to stay in that relationship. So it sounds
vulnerable.
Exactly. The more vulnerable we are. And so then it can sound like that's really not that big of a deal. Like, that's not a big accomplishment. Anybody can do that. When, first of all, our partners should be gassing us up and should be excited for us. They shouldn't be tearing us down, or, like, I usually equate it to, like, your balloon was inflated. You're really proud of yourself for this thing that happened or this accomplishment. And then because of their comment, your balloon deflated. And so when it's that day in and day out and it's comments like that, that's belittling and criticizing. And then we have extreme jealousy. And we always emphasize that extreme part because we're all human beings. We're going to get jealous. We're going to get envious. But there's a difference with the extreme where someone's trying to use their jealousy to control another human being, trying to use that to manipulate, guilt trip somebody, where it can look like because I'm jealous, it automatically means you did something wrong. So there's no conversation, there's no self-reflection, there's no trying to dig deeper about what's going on here. It's just, nope, automatically, you screwed up. What are you going to do to make it up for me?
Instead of I'm feeling insecure and let's have a conversation.
And let's talk about that. And let me try to figure out, like, wow, why am I feeling this way right now? So that's what we get really concerned about with extreme jealousy. And again, kind of like with volatility, we can see if people start changing their behaviors in order to avoid that jealousy, that can be a big red flag. Or the self-reflective idea of, if I would feel ashamed to tell my friends about my partner's jealousy because I know they wouldn't be okay with it, or I could predict how they would respond to it, I mean, that's a pretty big red flag of like what that jealousy is actually doing. Yeah. And then the final one that we really talk about is isolation, where not only are you physically isolated, so you don't see friends and family members anymore, you don't go hang out with people, you're not answering text messages or phone calls like you used to, but it's also this emotional isolation where the partner is like, you don't need anybody else. I'm the only, no, you don't need to call that person. Like, I've got this. I'm the only one you ever need to talk to. Or it's a little bit more vicious in the, sure, call your friends. I'm sure they won't even answer. They won't even believe you if you tell them. So why bother? So literally trying to disconnect you in so many ways from your people. And why that scares me is because when bad things happen, ultimately when things get worse, if you're all alone, what are you supposed to do? What are your options? How are you supposed to navigate that when you feel all by yourself? So yeah, those are the really big red flags we look out for.
So, I mean, I feel like as a young girl on TikTok, we hear a lot about gaslighting and love bombing. I feel like those words are very almost overused in some cases. So, I guess, can you just explain to me and to the viewers what those things are and maybe some examples?
Absolutely. I see a lot of similarities between love bombing and that intensity feeling. What's tricky about love bombing is that it can feel good. Like, it has love in the word. It does. It's some version of it, because it's like excessive gift giving or like really excessive compliments and comments. And it's not like, obviously we should be getting compliments from our partners and we should be giving those. But I wrote a few examples to really try to hone in on like what's the difference. And it's this idea of soulmate status really early on. It's like we've known each other for a
past lives.
Yes, past lives. And you're like, oh, okay. Yeah. It's the exaggerated examples. Like, I feel like you were created just for me, or my life would be nothing without you. Those, again, don't automatically mean, if like those words come out of somebody's mouth, don't automatically mean it's a terrible, awful thing or that it's abusive. However, if there's this pattern of these exaggerated compliments, of these, like, I've had 3 classes with you this whole semester. Like, what are we talking about?
Like, you're in love with me.
Yeah. You're just like, if it doesn't track for you, if the math isn't adding up, that's when I would say we might be in love bombing. And love bombing does tend to be used as like a smokescreen, so that it's like, here's all these shiny things. Look over here. Look at this shiny thing. Isn't it great? Isn't it wonderful? So then maybe you're not seeing the red flags for what they are that are happening over here. Or maybe you're more willing to make excuses for the times that they said something really belittling, or that they tried to control you with their jealousy. You're like, oh, well, this shiny, pretty thing, though. Like, they love me. They said it. So love bombing can look like that. And then gaslighting, at the heart of it, is this idea of trying to convince somebody that what they think and know to be true from like their viewpoint and their perspective is actually not only wrong, but they're crazy for thinking that way, for feeling that way. And so this can look like, look what you made me do. Complete, wildly inappropriate for a million different reasons. Complete lack of acknowledgement that, like, if I were to say those words, I'm not taking responsibility for my actions. I'm not then reflecting on what I am in control of and what I'm not in control of, and what I get to do with my feelings and what I don't get to do with my feelings. So me just saying, look what you made me do, this is your fault. That's gaslighting, because it's trying to convince you that I'm not actually in control of these things, and you are the one that has to change everything about you in order to make sure that my behavior never happens again, which is just not how humans work.
You're responsible for your own behaviors.
Yes. And I always talk about how you're allowed to feel your feelings. Everybody's allowed to feel your feelings. You're just not allowed to do whatever the fuck you want with those feelings. So that's what we really want to make sure we're hitting on. Gaslighting can also look like you're always making stuff up. That's not an appropriate way to navigate a conversation, an argument, a disagreement, nothing. Also, I never said that. Now, there's a difference in arguments with like a healthy relationship where it's like, no, that's not what I said. What I said was this, here, da, da, da. But I have kind of problem with that. Like, that I never said that. It's these kind of big buzzwords where I'm blaming you and then I'm saying never. And that's when I kind of get into like, is this person accurately representing this dialogue we had, this conversation we had, this argument we had? Or are they trying to convince me of a different perspective? I get really worried about that kind of language because, again, in a healthy argument, it would be like, I don't remember it happening this way. Like, I remember saying X, Y, Z. Yeah. So I'm not trying to bring you into my own reflection about my own words.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you.
Of course.
So I guess with all of these red flags in mind, I feel like we should probably go over some of the myths about interpersonal violence. So what is interpersonal violence and what are some common myths that we hear surrounding this topic?
So interpersonal violence for me is sexual assault, relationship violence, and stalking. I usually use the words interpersonal violence because sometimes people will say intimate partner violence, but it's not always a partner that's doing it. Sometimes it's a close friend. Sometimes it's an ex-partner. And I just want to make sure that when I'm speaking of these experiences, that if somebody can relate to these red flags, that they're included in that conversation and that they're allowed to seek services, seek support surrounding it. So interpersonal violence is really just like the broad term for talking about sexual assault, relationship violence, and stalking. And then some of the myths, I mean, we could go on and on about all the misconceptions about them. So I'll try to narrow it down. I think for the most part, like people know. So if I'm asking, true or false, most people who experience a sexual assault experience it by a complete stranger. People pretty readily say false. Yeah. What I think is fascinating, though, is that in a classroom setting, we know that information is false. Mm-hmm. When it comes to real life, it doesn't click, I think, because there is still this notion of, and of course, well, I know this person, so I must be safe. Or I know this person, so there's no way they would have done that. I think that's why gaslighting can happen so quickly. It's because, well, I know this person, I trust this person. That must actually be, they must have never said that. You know?
You trust them.
You trust them because you know them. And so even though I think like this part of our brain, the smart part of our brain, quote unquote, can tell us, oh, that's false. Most people know the individual who harmed them. When it comes to actually acting out in the world and behaving and being in the relationship, it kind of shifts it a little bit, and we don't believe that statistic anymore. Yeah. And so I think it has to do with the fact that it's because we think we trust them or that we know them or there's no way. I think we also have this misconception of like, well, only bad people do bad things. And something that I say time and time again is good people can do bad things all the time. And so it's a matter of like, how do we take these two very opposing ideas of like, well, in these ways they're a good person, but here's this terrible thing that they did. How could those exist at the same time? When they do, life's complicated, life's messy. And so I think that's like a big misconception that I think on paper people could pass the test and get that answer right. But as it plays out in their life, it's really complicated.
Hard to see.
Yeah, hard to see. And I would say, I think there's just a lot of victim blaming and rape myths that continue to be prevalent in society. And even though I think more and more in society now, people understand that men can experience sexual assault, there's still this very narrow idea of what it looks like, how you respond. Are you actually a real man if you experience that or not? There's just so much judgment and misinformation around it. So I think that's a really big one that we need to unpack and push back on. And I also think when it comes to consent, tend to exist in this realm of only a no is a no. And that's how I'm going to navigate consent moving forward. That's how I'm going to know we're on the same page, which is actually wild because the absence of information is not information. So what we'll talk about in future episodes is more of that affirmative consent. Only a yes is a yes, but I still think people rely on that. Like, but they didn't say no, or they didn't fight back.
But it's like, did their body language say no?
Exactly. Yeah.
Learning how to read humans.
Yep.
So I guess before we get into our next topic, since we also touched on that, can we explain the difference between harm prevention and risk reduction?
Absolutely. And I really appreciate making that distinction because as we're in this peer educator world, we have to be able to do both. And where true prevention is getting at this idea of we're creating circumstances and building skills so that harm never happens in the first place. So that's teaching affirmative consent early on. That's actually talking and helping people figure out how to have open communication and conflict management skills, because all of us are human beings. The last time I checked, we're going to get annoyed with people. We're going to get irritated. We're not going to agree. It's just a basic life skill to be able to talk to people through that in a healthy way. And a lot of research is slowly but surely showing that, like, when people have communication skills, and consent requires communication skills, like, so many beautiful things can build from there. So that's really what prevention is like creating all these opportunities so that harm never happens. And then risk reduction is acknowledging that it's probably already happening, or the risk factors are already there, the concerns are already there, but we're going to try to intervene so it doesn't get worse. We're going to try to do something now so that maybe the risk is lower or the amount of harm that happens is less. And so that's what bystander intervention looks like, because bystander intervention is noticing when things are kind of off, is noticing when things maybe aren't sitting exactly right. So the threshold's already there, like violence could happen, but we're going to say something so, again, it doesn't continue moving forward.
Again, one of those things of reading people and reading the room.
Absolutely.
So with that, we're going to go into boundaries. So we know that boundaries are very important in all aspects of life, just like communication, as you mentioned. So not even just in a romantic setting, but even in a work setting or personal, professional, all of those settings. How would you recommend that a person sets a boundary?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. I think we're, at least in my experience and kind of talking to a lot of people, I don't know if we're ever necessarily explicitly taught how to set boundaries. And so we kind of find ourselves in a situation where we're like, oh, crap, I need to figure this out. Yes, what do I do? And so when it comes to boundaries specifically, it's about, we need to start with knowing what ours are. And so that's recognizing what's okay with me and what's not okay with me. What's okay with me right now, given that it's Friday at the end of the week, versus Monday when I'm maybe fresh-faced and bushy-tailed because I've rested or whatever. Or it's like, it's almost the end of the semester, so maybe who I was at the beginning of the semester isn't the same person. Like, our boundaries are allowed to ebb and flow, but we need to know what those are. And so for the sake of this conversation, I won't get into how to build that, but there are lots of opportunities, like just Googling types of boundaries, and people give examples of, there's emotional boundaries, mental boundaries, time boundaries, like just being respectful of like your own calendar. And are you just double, triple booking yourself all the time because you just can't say no, or you can't prioritize? Yeah. And so we just have to start with knowing what makes sense for us. And then from there, it's about communicating them. And that seems easier said than done. But sometimes it's just about starting small. Sometimes maybe communicating it just means, I'm going to write down this boundary and tape it on my computer so that I have to see it every day, so that I'm reminding myself that, like, this is something that I want to work on. It could be communicating this to your partner or to a close friend, kind of like an accountability kind of experience, because that's what I've noticed works for me. Every time that I start to tell somebody, like, this is a thing I'm working on, I notice that I actually push myself to do it because I have this external accountability part to it. And so I do recommend like communicating it in some capacity, not just to keep yourself accountable, but so then people have an expectation like, oh, Maddie said that she doesn't have appointments after 3 o'clock on some Fridays because she needs to conserve that space for answering emails. Like, I know that. She's told me that already. So that it's not actually a surprise when I can't get a hold of her at 3:30 on Friday. You know? And so it's also helpful when we communicate and then people forget. We can be like, hey, remember that time?
Remember that time I told you
about this boundary?
Not available. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So that can be really helpful. And then what I think is so important and so difficult to do is keeping that communication simple. I think especially as we're learning a boundary, especially depending on how we grew up, we feel like we need an excuse or a reason in order to set a boundary. We can't just set a boundary because we're a human being and we need one. It has to be for this very clear reason or for this excuse. And just being like, nope, this is my boundary. You don't owe anybody any explanation, and getting more and more comfortable with that is really important and powerful. And then the final one is setting consequences for if and when your boundaries are violated. And setting consequences doesn't always mean how am I going to punish this person for violating my boundaries, but sometimes it means, okay, if I notice this person consistently violates my boundaries, what am I going to do next? And sometimes that means I'm going to loop in my boss, actually. That's the consequence, is that now it's my boss that has to intervene on this. Or I'm going to get my friend who's scary, to say something. Yeah. Or it's just, you know what? I'm going to distance myself from this person because I've recognized that they don't treat me the way I should be treated. So
would that be a time that you would tell the person, like, I'm going to take a step back because you're not respecting my boundaries?
If you feel, I think that's appropriate in some circumstances. It depends on your relationship with them, how you think they'll respond to that. I think there's some people in my life where I feel like I could easily set that boundary and it wouldn't be a shit show, for lack of a better word. But sometimes we do have to keep in mind our safety in setting boundaries, because I especially think in the realm of abusive relationships, like setting boundaries with people looks completely differently. And so explicitly communicating this is why I'm doing XYZ might not be the best option. And so that's why setting consequences can be nebulous, and it just kind of depends on what makes sense for that moment.
Definitely. So I also kind of wanted to go more into professional boundaries specifically, because I know that we treat the people in our lives a little bit differently than we normally treat people in a professional setting. So could we just maybe share how to go about setting a boundary at work specifically?
Yes. I think there are a lot of options, and especially if anybody's like me, where you had to start from having set 0 boundaries in your whole life to then figuring out how do I even do this. I had to start really small, and I had to start external. For example, at my old job, I worked with families a lot, and sometimes we got to take them out to do fun things that cost money. And we didn't just have like a endless, infinite budget for that. And so when I had to set boundaries and essentially tell a kid no, that was really hard for me. So what I would do is like, my boss said, we can't today. I'm so sorry. So that's like external. Yeah. I've blamed my boss essentially in that moment. And of course, like that was something me and my boss agreed to. And so that like, if a call were to come back to my boss was prepared to be like, yep, I said that they can't spend money on that. Sorry. Like, and they were the one to have to own it. I think also with starting small means I had to set boundaries with people that I really trusted. And sometimes it's just over like a really tiny thing of like, okay, rather than staying from 5 till 10:30 at my friend's house, I'll stay till 10:15 and I'll really try to get out the door at 10:15. Because that felt safer, and I felt like I could build the skill set of like, well, okay, I gotta go because I want to go and whatever. And then especially just starting with friends, that felt like I knew they wouldn't judge me, or it wouldn't turn into like a weird argument or a pushback thing with certain friends. Like I knew I could build my confidence and get the words I wanted to start using under wraps by working with people I knew that would just flow.
And people that respect you.
Exactly. Yeah. So we don't have to be like expert level boundary setters at the beginning of learning how to set boundaries. So we can enter on the novice level and
go
practice.
with the flow.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think that's really important. And sometimes this also just means that if you have a work calendar or even just your own personal calendar, blocking time. Just like I made that example earlier of like Fridays at 3:00, like I just make sure I blocked off email time or whatever. And I'll have to do that sometimes because I know if I don't, my time boundary will get interrupted with people swinging by, plugging something in. But once it's blocked, people tend to respect that. Like, especially in a work setting, they see that. Now, there will be times where maybe they can
just
read.
Squeeze me in.
Oh, yeah. Oh, come it'll just be 30 minutes. Yeah. Or like, oh, I see you're just working on notes. Can we go to this meeting or whatever? And so then that's where your other skill set has to come in of being able to like, actually, this is due. Or actually, I need to get this done because this is also a vital part of my job.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not always going to be this, oh, I blocked off my calendar, so people will automatically respect that. But it does create a window for you where most people do.
And you can kind of reinforce it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, now that we have all of the basics covered, we're going to have to get into the nitty-gritty of this episode. Bystander intervention. Yes. So how would you describe bystander intervention and when can or should it be used?
Yeah. So bystander intervention at the heart of it is just this idea of you are not the one directly impacted by the weird thing or the thing that seems really off. You're the bystander. But that doesn't mean you don't have a role. And so what we want to do and what research is showing is that the more like the community responds to things or just peers, friends, family members engages, the less likely that harm happens. Like the more positive things we start to see in the world. So bystander intervention is really trying to call in the bystander to just help people out. And what I love about bystander intervention is oftentimes people have this misconception of like, well, okay, to be an active bystander, that means I have to rip the two people apart who are fighting, like full out fist fight in a bar. Or it means I have to say, hey, how dare you say that? And like be this really like firm, aggressive person in response. And like, although that's an option, that is not the only option. And that's what I love about bystander intervention is it gives you so many different tools and strategies to use that you then get to decide what makes sense for you, what makes sense for this situation, and which one am I going to use? Because there's no hierarchy to them. It's not like, well, Maddie secretly thinks that this one is the best one, so you should actually do that. It's going to be so dependent on the context of the situation. And I just think it's important to remember that piece. And the idea behind bystander intervention is that we do something rather than doing nothing. And so what I also really appreciate about it is that we can intervene, we can say something, we can do something without ever making an accusation against somebody. We're just listening to that gut feeling and we're just trying to step in and just double check or make sure it doesn't get weirder or worse. And we're never accusing anybody. Because I think a lot of people have that fear of like, well, they're a good person, and if I say something, that means I'm telling them that they're racist or homophobic or awful. Yeah. Like, that's not what we're talking about. Yeah.
It sounds like such an elementary skill, like do something if you see something bad is happening. So I guess I when it's said aloud, it sounds so simple. Yeah. So I guess why do humans find it so hard to do? Like what stops us from intervening in situations that are uncomfortable or that where we get that gut feeling?
I think a lot of it is people want to assume good intentions. Mm-hmm. It's that idea, circling back to something that I mentioned earlier, of like it's really hard to see that good people can do bad things. Yeah. We have a very specific idea about what a bad person is, or who is the type of person to engage in a bad behavior, or what does sexual assault look like, or what does violence in a relationship look like. Like when we have those very narrow, specific ideas about violence in general, we then miss the red flags, or we're going to convince ourselves, I'm sure that's not what's going on. It's fine. Or sometimes there's a mentality, especially in the state of Montana, of that's not my problem. I'm not going to put my nose in other people's business. And, for the most part, that's not like a bad thing to like follow your life by. Like if you're just trying to be like a gossip person, like that's not helpful. But I always kind of push back on that's not my problem with they're your friend and your brain had you notice something that felt not okay.
And there's a reason for that.
And there's a reason for that. So it is kind of your problem then, because you're saying this isn't okay. So why are we just walking away then? And I also think people don't intervene because they fear being embarrassed. They fear making a fool of themselves. They fear that they'll make the situation worse. They'll fear that they'll be retaliated against. That if they step in and say something, now they'll be the person who's now impacted negatively by this situation. And what I want to say, for all the reasons why we don't intervene, it doesn't make somebody a bad person. It just makes us human. And so it's completely understandable to have these thoughts, to think about these things. And we have to decide for ourselves what feels safe and what feels right. Again, what I love about bystander intervention is that there's so many options to address those safety concerns to keep you safe while you're still doing something. And then I also think it challenges us to make sure that we're aligning with our values, which is we love our friends. And no matter which side they are on the violent side, I would want to help somebody because we all need that love and intervention sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah. That was beautifully said. Wow. So I guess with that, how can we ensure that we are prepared to intervene, and what are some of those tools that you might recommend using?
I think I joke about this, but I'm like, teach bystander intervention enough, and then you'll be like, well, crap, I can't be a hypocrite by not intervening right now when I literally teach this all the time. Yeah. I've just noticed that personally within myself. I'm like, well, now I gotta practice what I preach.
Because you're aware.
Because I'm aware of it. I have no excuse, essentially. But in all honesty, we always talk about the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. Let's see if I can get them off right off the top of my head. There's direct, there's distract, delay, delegate, and document.
Gorgeous. Gorgeous.
Finally teaching it enough to just be able to whip that out. So direct, I think, is the one that we always automatically think of. We think it's like, okay, 2 people are fist fighting. I'm going to directly step in. Stop! Get away from each other. Yeah. Blow your whistle. Yeah. Or it's somebody said something terrible, like a just crappy joke or just something terrible. And we have to be like, why the fuck would you say that? Yeah. And again, those 2 things are options, but never underestimate the power of being like, I hope no one ever talks about your mom like that. Because I think that can be such a huge, like, jarring, like, oh yeah, if somebody said that about my mom, I'd be pissed. And it's that reflection of, okay, if it's not okay to say to your mom, it's probably just not okay to say to another human being. So how about we just
My favorite is, that's an odd thing to say out loud.
That's such an odd
That's such a weird thing to say.
Like, that was weird, or that sounds like an inside thought. Like, I love that one so much. Because again, I'm not here to tell people the opinions they're allowed to have, the thoughts they're allowed to have, but legitimately there are some things you say out loud, and there's some things you just don't. You just don't. And I also love the strategy of asking somebody to explain the joke. Because I don't know if you've ever told a joke before and then had to explain it and just felt
never, thank God.
No, that's never happened to me. That has been your dream. That's embarrassing.
Yeah, it's so embarrassing.
But that just like, wait, I don't get it. Why is that funny? Or like, what's the joke? And then people have to, again, you're not accusing them of anything, but you're challenging them to be like, oh, okay, well, it's funny because
I'm
because never mind. Yeah. And it's like, perfect. Now we can move on. We at least did something to call out that we're not okay with that.
Yeah. Bad behavior. We don't like that.
Exactly. And then distract. I think I'm a distract person. It's just the idea of we're going to do something to break the tension, interrupt the moment so that it doesn't get worse, or so that the other person has an opportunity to GTFO if they need to. And what that can look like is maybe you drop something, maybe you sneeze really loud, like do the classic dad sneeze, like or you are going to just ask a really random question, like, oh my gosh, did you see that email come out? Like, what am I supposed to do? I don't know what to do about that. And then you're literally getting that person's attention. You're trying to find that email, and you're just creating a whole new pivot for that. And they're endless. It's only limited by your imagination at that point, like what you can do for distract. And I think sometimes we all naturally do that anyway, I think, and we just don't recognize it. as being an active bystander. But when I was in college and you're on the dance floor and you notice that your friend's not having a good time with the person they're dancing with, and you do something to distract, or you dance in between them, or you grab your friend's hand and just start dancing with them, or you're like, I gotta go to the bathroom, you gotta come with me.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Like, I think we all naturally do that sometimes, and it's recognizing, just do that more. Just lean in on those skills a little bit more. And that's bystander intervention. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. And
What
then,
about
delay is maybe the situation has come and gone. Maybe it wasn't appropriate for you to say something in that moment. So it's just following up the person that you thought was impacted in that situation, asking them if they're okay, asking them if they need anything. Hey, like, can I help you find your friends here? Or, hey, I've heard about CCR. Would you like me to walk with you? Do you want me to wait with you while your Uber's coming? Hey, I heard that joke too, and I didn't think it was funny. How can I help? Did you think it was funny? And I think with that one, it can be really powerful, because what if the person responds with, I'm actually so glad you said something, because that's like the 8th time this person has said something gross like that before, and I have no idea what to do about it. Or they might be like, no, I thought it was fucking hilarious. And you're like, cool,
Right.
glad I double checked. Okay, bye. So again, delay is just about, like, why not double check?
Yeah.
Why not just
circle
ask?
back around?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, why not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Might as well.
Yep.
Perfect. And then delegate.
Delegate just means you don't have to do this alone. So sometimes that just means, like, hey, I'll create the distraction, you delay.
Yeah.
And like, you go and see if they're okay. Or it could just be, I don't know those people, but I know my friend does. So maybe they're the more appropriate person to intervene right now. Or it's grabbing a person of authority. So that could be like the bartender or the bouncer at the bar. Or if you're like on an athletic team, it's like, maybe there's a senior on the team and they have more power in this situation than you as a sophomore in that situation. And so really, like, power is nebulous in that situation. So it can just be whoever you think maybe there's more popular on the team. So maybe they're the right person to go intervene. And it just means that if you're noticing something, it doesn't feel like maybe you're the right person to intervene, that information doesn't live and die with you, though.
You can reach out to like other people around you. Perfect. And then document.
Yes. Document can look a lot of different ways. I'll start with, if you feel like the best option for you in that moment is to like video record the situation. In the state of Montana, it can't be done in secret. So that means you hit record and you go, hey, I'm recording this right now. And then you're capturing everything.
So you can as long as you say it aloud, even if they don't necessarily hear you, it's fine.
It has to be like reasonably known.
Okay.
So it can't be like, hey, I'm recording this.
I'm recording.
Yeah, exactly. It has to be reasonably known. And so that's what's really important to remember. But also, document can look like other things. Maybe it's screenshotting social media posts if that's where everything's happening. It's screenshotting text messages, saving emails. It's sending emails. Like if you type up an email that says, this happened on this day and time, so-and-so is involved, this person just witnessed this is how I felt about it, and then you shoot that email to yourself, you shoot that email to somebody you trust, that's a paper trail. That is documentation that could be used in the future if you want it to be.
Get those receipts.
Yes!
Get the receipts!
Exactly.
Perfect. Okay, there are so many options, obviously, for how you can intervene based on who you are as a person and how the situation looks. I guess, is there anything else that we should be doing in these situations?
I think it's just a matter of checking in with yourself and, like, you're noticing this situation. You've noticed it. Your eyes tracked it. You are cueing in that maybe something's a little off, or maybe you don't know everything that's going on, but it's sticking out to you. That's important. That recognition is important. And bystander intervention is just saying, take one additional step to just double check. That's it.
Yeah. So would you say with the 5 Ds, use one and then maybe use another one later kind of thing?
The beauty of bystander intervention, kind of in that example where it was like delegate plus delay combo, a lot of people tend to realize like, oh wait, I'll create a distraction and also loop in another professional person to intervene, and maybe I'll still document it. you don't have to choose just one. It's about what actually makes sense for you and what's the best strategy for this moment. Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Bystander intervention is the best we have right now.
It is. It
So,
really is the best we have. So, yeah.
okay, sweet.
Yeah.
Thanks, Maddie.
Yeah, of course.